Breaking Down the Law is sponsored by Battle-Born Injury Lawyers.
Presidential election recounts happening in Georgia and Wisconsin. The Trump campaign has filed several lawsuits across the country, including here in Nevada. But there's also local races being contested and litigated, including a lawsuit just filed today from Ross Miller, as we mentioned earlier in the broadcast. Here to discuss the lawsuits and the recounts from a legal perspective, attorney Matt Hoffmann with Battle-Born Injury Lawyers. Matt, as always, pleasure to have you on the show. Lots of questions. Where do we start? I guess we start local and talk about this lawsuit now being filed by Ross Miller.
I took a look at it this morning. It's an interesting lawsuit, and it seems to have quite a bit of validity. So simplistically, what Ross Miller is saying is that Joe Gloria, the Clark County Register of Voters, they basically skipped a step, and a step that they didn't have authority to do. And what they're saying in the lawsuit is, look, the votes were in, you found some irregularities, that's fine, report those, but it's not your job to do anything other than certify the vote. And then once certified, it's now the challenger's responsibility to raise the issue in court, to, whether it's court or to request a recount, what have you, under the Constitution and the various Nevada statutes. That's who has the burden to challenge this thing. And it's up to the court to decide, if it went that way, whether to order a recount. And what happened here is the registrar just said, well, we see these irregularities. We don't think it's, sufficient to certify it. So we're just going to throw out all the ballots and do a new vote. And so what Ross Miller's team is saying is you can't do that. That goes against the Constitution of Nevada. It goes against the Nevada statutes. And it's somewhat similar to the lawsuit situation we see in Pennsylvania with President Trump's team. In Pennsylvania, and I'm talking specifically about the deadline issue, you had the legislature said the deadline is, November 3rd or November 6th, whatever it was, at 6 o'clock p.m. All the votes have to be cast, including mail-in ballots. And that's their right, that's their job. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court came in and gave a 3-day extension of that. And what the Trump team is doing is challenging that action, saying, you don't have any authority to overrule the legislature under your own state law and constitution. And by doing so, what should have happened is every single vote after the legislative deadline should now be thrown out. Now, I don't know how many that is or whether it would make a difference, but that's kind of the similarities of these two lawsuits. They both involve a branch of government allegedly overstepping its bounds and taking on a task that's, given to another branch. And so it'll be interesting to see how both of those turn out. So
it essentially is kind of a checks and balances thing, not necessarily the result itself, but just the way that it was handled. And then, Matt, I guess, is there a possibility that it could go all the way to the Supreme Court? Is that something that you would expect to see?
Well, I think that with regard locally, it'll go to the Nevada Supreme Court almost certainly. It's a 10-vote margin, but I think that Mr. Ross Miller's team has a pretty good argument. As to President Trump, I think that it will definitely go to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, on the Pennsylvania issue, because it's the highest court, in the state has already made a decision. So the next court of jurisdiction would be the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay, and so with about 1 minute left here to kind of recap, what do you think is the big takeaway from this? Because all this litigation now is kind of just clouding up our vision of what happened with our election process. So what happens now, Matt, down the road?
Yeah, I saw on social media somebody said that Canada must feel like they live in the apartment above a meth lab.
I saw that.
It's just been it's been chaos. But I think that the takeaway from this is everyone take a step back. Forget whether you support Trump or don't like Trump, or you support Ross Miller or you don't support Ross Miller, or any of these candidates. All of this litigation is ultimately a check on the system to get some kind of an improvement. And look no further than Florida. 20 years ago, Florida was the laughingstock of the nation, with the hanging chads, in the Bush v. Gore,
Right.
It was a nightmare. And now 20 years later, Florida is essentially the gold standard. They have mail-in voting, they have a hybrid mix, and we knew the results in Florida at 10 o'clock Eastern on election day. Okay. And so the takeaway is maybe these are annoying, maybe these are chaotic. And I don't think it's going to change the election result, but they're important for the next elections because we want to make sure we have some kind of uniformity going forward. And I don't like Nevada being involved in this chaos. I think it's a bad look.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm sure all of us are on that same page. We just have to be forward thinking. Matt, as always, we appreciate you and your insight, and we will see you again next week.